Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Right to Read Initiative. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth from Garforth Education, and today I have the pleasure of having Lynn Stone from Australia join me again for our third conversation, and today it's her thoughts about spelling. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. The Right to Read Initiative Facebook group has been getting lots of requests to join. Please feel free to join, but if you're asking to join, answer the questions so that we know you are a real person wanting to join and not someone who's going to spam us. So today's conversation is about spelling, and I'm sure that you feel the same way, that English is not crazy. It's not illogical. There is a logic, and we need to start teaching that logic to our students, regardless of whether learning to read was easy for them or not. Because just saying, well, that's just the way it is, isn't enough and doesn't help our students learn. What do you think, Lynn?
Absolutely agreed, Kathryn. I think there are quite a few myths that we need to bust about the English orthography, about the writing system that English has. And one of those myths is that it's somehow inexplicable and crazy and random. It's none of those things. When people struggle with spelling, it's not because of deficits within the language itself. It's either deficits within their ability to process the language, around which you can make very, very good fixes, or it's deficits in teacher knowledge. And that's where I come in. I try to raise teacher capacity and knowledge in this area so that then we don't default to things like, oh, look, that's just the way it is. You're going to have to learn this word as just like a whole shape. Those are not good mnemonics, but, the English orthography has fantastic memory hooks once you tap into that system. So that's what a lot of my job is about.
Of course. So formally speaking, and I definitely want to make sure that we do some definitions of some of the jargon associated with spelling. English has a deep orthography. So let's just get your quick definition of what exactly does that mean, a deep orthography, and what's a shallow orthography?
Cool. Well, orthography, it's the way that letters are organized within a written system. So it's a print-based system. That's an orthography, and English has one. It's when you have transparent orthographies where, you've got this set of letters and you can pick any one of those letters and you basically know what sound that's going to represent within a word. That's a transparent orthography. Or you hear a word and you're pretty certain that this sequence of letters is going to spell that word. So we've got, things like Finnish and Indonesian, one-to-one grapheme phoneme match, and that's awesome. English, however, isn't one of those languages. It has it as it when you're teaching to read, or teaching children to read, or teaching them to write. Yes, there's a transparency at first that you need to teach. That is, we've got 26 letters, and most of the time, those letters are going to represent a default sound, the most common sound. So the letter A mostly is going to represent A. The letter B is mostly going to represent B. And when you hear A or B in a word, probably A or B, but there's another layer to that system. So you can teach it transparently at first, but then there's another layer. And one of the things that governs the unique sequence of letters in the words of English is etymology, so where the words came from, morphology, what the meaningful units within those words are and how they're sequenced together. And even in English, we have borrowed words, uncommon spellings, and so on. And they, again, sort of break that one-to-one phoneme grapheme rule that we first teach in systematic synthetic phonics. So that layer makes the orthography complex. That's the difference. That's what, those are the big factors. It's not one-on-one grapheme phoneme. So therefore, we have to approach the teaching of spelling and writing and reading with that in mind. Otherwise, we're teaching as if it's a transparent orthography, and it's not. The biggest thing to look out for in that is this notion, which is not true, that writing is speech written down. It's not. Spelling and writing is language written down, not speech. So if you stop at speech, yeah, it's going to be a problem, because there's that underlying layer, that historical, etymological, morphological layer. And that's the bit, I mean, teachers just don't get this information when they trained in their degrees, and it's their intellectual property once again.
Yeah. So there's a common analogy of reading is breathing in and writing is breathing out. Yes and no, because yes, reading, you're taking in the information by reading, and breathing out, you are putting it on the paper, but it doesn't require the exact same instruction. If it did, if a student was a fluent reader, they'd be a fluent writer. But it's more complex than that.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, writing also has that mechanical aspect to it as well. So now we're looking at the simple view of writing. There's mechanics, conventions, and then text generation. So there's lots more to think about when you're writing. And the mechanics, like posture, paper grip, pencil grip, paper position, motor control, that's the mechanics. Then there's the conventions, punctuation, spelling, you know, grammar. And then there's text generation, which is, you know, planning, editing, drafting. None of those things are present in reading. There is so much more of the brain to control with writing, and it's a lot harder. And spelling is a massive part of that. That doesn't work well. It doesn't do well in the absence of explicit instruction in that system.
Of course. Now, one of the big things that we need to consider when we're looking at the orthography and the spelling of the English language is history. And instead of using an elevator analogy, let's use a people mover or an escalator analogy. We're going step by step through when written language first started in English to where we are today. What are some of those steps that we've gone through that's had an impact on our spelling system?
Do you mean, Kathryn, things like the Great Vowel Shift and standardization from printers? Is that what you're alluding to?
Well, and just looking at the beginning where we have those old English words and the Norse words and the influences of the different languages that have been introduced to English.
Yeah, look, one thing I do really well, right, is words. You see numbers? I don't do it that well. So I could not even tell you off the top of my head any dates, any timeline, because I don't hold that information in my head very well. Right, but I can talk to you about standardization, because that's a really huge influence on how English is. And I think it also demonstrates the difference between spoken and written language. They are different forms of language, and they have different conventions around them. So what happened, and I really don't know when, could have been last week, I don't know, right? But printing presses came out, right? Where we started mass publication rather than just have someone, you know, a scribe sitting there writing it all down or copying it. We invented these ways of mass producing print. But if you look at the United Kingdom, right, that's a nation made up of 4 separate nations. That in itself is a linguistic, conundrum, right? Because they're all speaking a slightly different version of English. And not only are they doing that, but they're speaking with different accents, because the United Kingdom is quite densely populated, and population density is one of the things that drives diversity in accent. So if you look at Australia, right, not a very dense population for such a huge landmass, right? So it's very hard to tell one Australian from another, no matter where they're from. There's just not very much accent variation. Whereas if you live in London, for instance, somewhere dense like that, you can tell a North Londoner from a South Londoner, from an East Londoner, from a West Londoner, right? Because it's so dense. So you think about that, right? We've got all these words, and everyone's saying them differently. And the printers are going, look, you're spelling this in your accent. And actually, That's not my accent, and it's certainly not the accent of the audience, you know, that we that we want to communicate to. We're going to have to set some of these words in concrete. We're going to have to actually go, okay, this is how you spell this. I don't care how you say it. And that's where speaking and spelling diverged, right? A long time ago. I'm going to say like the 1600s. But you should, don't quote me on that. Look that up, right? It's easy to look up. But so this is where spelling and speaking diverged. They went, no, that's it. We're not writing in your regional accent anymore. This is how you spell through. This is how you spell thorough. This is, you know, and so on. Anyway, that's called standardization, and it happens over time. But there came a point where this is how we spell stuff. And the speaking, you know, continued to change around it. So when I hear questions on social media like, what are the sounds in this word? When somebody's trying to teach a word to a student, my answer is always, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. What matters is, what the question should be is, what is that sequence, and why is that sequence of letters the way it is? And what other words share that sequence? Mm-hmm. That's a productive question. So I hope we haven't veered off there, but you know, that's my history in a nutshell. It's speaking and spelling diverge. Spelling is a system here, speaking is a system there, and they cross over, but they're not mirror images of one another, not by a long shot. That's it.
Well, and I guess the other thing that I was hoping to bring in is how our spelling system takes in like spelling patterns from various different languages, right? So we have the PH from the Greek, and the different ways of spelling the vowels.
We didn't have an alphabet, right? So we went, can we borrow one from somewhere? You know, and we got the Latin alphabet. Already that was a problem, because there were sounds that were made in English that weren't made, you know, in Latin. So we had to start doing digraphs as well. That in itself makes a system complex, right? When you're combining and recombining. You know, so Latin's huge influence, Greek, huge influence. And so we've taken, with Greek, we mark the Greek aspect of the words that we're borrowing by things like PH and AE, you know, like an encyclopedia, although you don't do that. Do you do that in Canada? The US, they don't, you know, they don't do AE.
It all depends whether you're going for a more British spelling or the American spelling. And I mean, it's the same with color and center. Like it all depends where exactly you are. We're kind of on both ships.
Wow. So you have autonomy in that. That's interesting. What do you lean towards, Kathryn, yourself?
Personally, British.
Interesting, because that's more complex. You know, the American spelling is a simplification, and a very, very successful simplification. So that I find that interesting, that you would go for the more complex. Why do you do that?
That's just what they did in school. But then it's hard when you go to try and publish something or produce something, because the majority of Canadians go with the British. But if you're writing something for the Americans, you use the American spelling. It's complicated.
It's an eternal conundrum. I will always go for a simple wherever I can. And if I know that I'm communicating to someone who has different spelling from me, sometimes I'll switch over. But you know what? The differences in spelling don't disambiguate any of the words. So it doesn't matter. Absolutely doesn't matter. It's like ISE and IZE, which is an Oxford-Cambridge distinction. It doesn't matter. Actually doesn't matter at all. So go for your life. That's the other thing.
Of course. So I guess my big question to you is how important, because you have the linguistic background and you have worked with speech and language pathologists. So in those beginning first teachings, when we're working on the letter, sound, grapheme, phoneme correspondences, how important is it for these children to learn how to count the phonemes in a word and recognize the number? Like in your book, you're having people underline syllables in a word. But when working with one syllable words, when we're doing CVC, CCVVC, whatever words, Do you still feel it's important to do that one-to-one correspondence at that basic level and then say, okay, now that we're moving on to more complex words, we're going to do it this way?
Well, yes. And I don't think the transfer to more complex words means a change of approach. Obviously, sound symbol correspondences are the initial driver of uptake of literacy. They're very, very important to do. And that's why phonological awareness is important to screen for and to, to remediate, because that sequence of sound symbols is your starting point. You got it. That's your framework, and a very worthy framework it is. I don't see any reason not to. Once there's a fairly good correspondence being established, not just in recognition but also in retrieval of these grapheme phonemes. When that happens, I don't see any reason to not introduce morphemes, to not introduce, a basic understanding of etymology and what that is and how that drives word families and how that drives spelling patterns. It's not a problem at all if it's well taught at the beginning, which is, I think we were talking last time about systematic synthetic phonics and how that will lay that foundation, so that you can put the other really interesting stuff on top of it as early as possible, because there's a lot to learn about this system.
And again, we can and should be introducing it early, because then those little minds aren't as boggled.
Yeah, and it busts that myth again, doesn't it? It busts that can lead to learned helplessness, that can lead to, I give up. I just, this is too hard. I don't want to know anything about this. And I see that a lot. We see that a lot in our practice, lifelong literacy, children who have just walked away because they're convinced that this is an impenetrable system that's not for them. They don't have the key. And actually, it's not that hard to give them the keys to that system. That's what we advocate for.
Yeah, and it's a different train of thought and a way of approaching things to say, you know what, I'm going to give you the information instead of, we're going to see if you can figure it out yourself. Exposure to quality literacy and literature and amazing books and illustrations and pictures, you're going to pick it up on your own.
Yeah, I'm going to love you all the way to reading.
Yes.
That tell them how the system works and get them to practice. I mean, it's a no-brainer, really, isn't it? But it does, then that actually then requires quite a high level of teacher knowledge. And that's not handed to teachers on a plate, sadly, when it could be, but it's not. They have to go and discover their way, to quality literacy learning. They have to, they got to do it on a project basis. It's horrible for them. But luckily,
it's unfair. It's unfair for teachers to have to do this on the job learning, but it's a situation that we're in, and we need to better it for teachers of the future. Absolutely. It's not something they likely had in their education unless they happen to stumble upon linguistics courses during their undergraduate programs.
Yep. Or even then, linguistics courses will tell you about the structure, but they won't tell you how to apply that structure, or show others how to apply that structure. There's a lot missing from initial teacher education, I think. And it starts with linguistics, but
there's more. Yeah. So when I was, I've been reviewing your books recently just to prepare for this. And there's something that I pulled out that I consider the 3 Fs. And it's from chapter 4 from Spelling for Literacy. Can you think of those 3 Fs, or do you want me to give them to you?
Chapter 4 in Spelling for Life?
Yes.
And 3 Fs?
Yes.
No, can't remember. I don't know what you're talking about.
Form, feature, and function.
Right. That old chestnut.
How do these fit into our spelling?
Well, look at it this way, okay? So let's have a 50,000 feet view of it. Words, okay, are not the things themselves. Words are abstract representations of the thoughts that we have, and those words can have different forms. They can come in different, or they can be expressed in different ways. So they can be expressed through the orthographic form, and that's the sequence of letters that go to make that word that word. There's a phonological form as well, the way that it appears in speech. There's a lexical form. It's got what are its meanings, what other words are attached to it, and so on. So there's all these different forms. If you're studying a word, the way I look at it is you've got to find out, or you've got to decide when you're actually embarking on study of a word or a word family, what form you're going to focus on. What is the most memorable form? I'll give you two examples, right? See if you're trying to teach the spelling of the word one, as in this is one finger. If you go via the phonological form and go sound it out, okay, what you're going to do is you're just going to hit a brick wall, because there's very little phoneme grapheme correspondence there. So wrong form, right? Wrong part, right? What you need to look at is the fact that it's got ON in it, which happens a lot in words to do with one, like lone, alone, lonely, none, right? That's that form, and that's, morphological. That form is going to be easier to remember. So that's what you're going to be studying. So the form, feature, function part, the way I'm talking about it, is it's about trying to encourage teachers to make a decision about how are we going to study this? Is it because of its features? Is it because of its function? Is it because of the way it appears in the universe? How are we going to study that? And then you make informed decisions about what is going to stick. That's the 3 Fs. Although I've never called it the 3 Fs before, now I will call it the 3 Fs.
It just made sense to me. All right. Now, so we have this deep orthography, and it's because our language is a morphophonemic language. And I really think we need to add etymological, phonemic. I don't know, we need to get etymology in that saying.
Morphology and etymology are very, they're
very close, yes.
Yeah. So, they feed into one another, obviously, because it's, again, the morphemes, the meaningful units, and the way that they're set out that drive the sequence of letters in words. And those morphemes all have etymologies, as do graphemes, as do the letters of the alphabet that we're using in this writing system. They have etymology as well. They have similarities in families, and they have origins across languages as well. So you start to see these patterns within English and outside English as well, that shows you the history of those letters, which is fascinating in itself. So it's a layered artifact. It's a complex artifact, But again, that can be taught efficiently or inefficiently, or ignored, in fact, or taught as if it's transparent. It's a disaster when you start to teach a complex orthography as if it's transparent, because what happens is you start getting children having to learn hundreds of bits of code. You're treating it like it's pictographic or something. It totally isn't, which is why I get really concerned when I go into classrooms and I'll see like a wall covered in spelling choices.
Yeah,
you don't choose these things randomly. They are governed by set, finite sets of morphemes and graphemes. It's a way too random right now, but we can solve that by systematically teaching how it's all structured, which is my job.
Yes, it is. You were wonderful at it.
Oh, you're nice.
So one of the things that I think some teachers are really getting good at their phonics instruction and teaching the grapheme phoneme correspondence, and that helps with the phonology of the language. But it's that morphology, etymology piece that they need support developing. And looking at that, do you think that there's a great way to start? Because there are so many teachers that are like, okay, I've heard about morphemes, and there's morphemes, there's affixes, there's prefixes, there's suffixes, there's bases, free bases. Do you feel that there's a common language that we can use that recognizes, yes, you can have those, the tier 3 vocabulary words that are very subject specific. And if you were going to go into linguistics and morphology, that's one thing, but it's okay for the layman to use, a prefix, root, and affix and be okay with that? Or do you feel that it's important to make those distinctions between the combining forms and the bases? And what's your experience?
Yeah, I think it's important that teachers continue to raise their capacity in this and raise their knowledge, not only because it's interesting and fascinating, but because I think teachers' knowledge should always be bigger than students' knowledge, right? So in terms of etymology and morphology, it's a lifelong learning curve, if you like. You don't stop learning stuff about this, right? And as you continue to learn, it gives you a deeper and broader base to draw on when you encounter things outside the scope and sequence of whatever it is that you're using or whatever it is that you've come up with. So that's an advantage. Of course, anything like any human artifact that is sort of thought-based, which is writing, it's a thought-based artifact. It's really, really, fascinating, but also difficult to pin down. So if you're studying something like that, something complex like that is to do with thinking, you're going to have debate regarding terms. And that's important, definitely, to look at, but doesn't make you a better or a worse teacher of that as such, right? It just means that there are some approaches that will use this definition, and there are some approaches that will use this definition. But the big question for educators is, can you teach it? Can you make it so that the students that you're working with improve? And I don't think you have to know absolutely everything in order to bring about changes in long-term memory in your students. It's a good idea to strive towards knowing everything. Of course it is, right? That's what we do. But there's some very basic knowledge that you can have and impart that will create changes in long-term memory of your students. If that's your job, right? Ultimately, that is the job of an educator in primary school and in secondary school as well, to create change in long-term memory. So with spelling, you can do that with, armed with some knowledge. That's basically my answer. And you also at the beginning of your question asked, what's a good starting point, or is there a starting point? And my answer is, the starting point is start, right? Start talking about it and reading about it. So go to things like the History of English podcast. And there are lots of structured word inquiry, Facebook groups and sites and so on. That's a really solid body of work. Realspellers.com, I think it's .com. A very, very solid body of work that will start to awaken that linguistic curiosity and that capacity and knowledge. I recommend all of those things. There's the Oxford etymologist who Anatoly Lieberman, who wrote the foreword to Spelling for Life, the book. He comes out with a blog every week on new etymology that he's either discovered or words that he's been thinking about. Great thing to follow. There's lots and lots out there, and my recommendation is start and then start talking about it. And amazingly enough, you won't be disappointed. You'll never be disappointed, once you start talking through this incredible system.
Definitely. And the one thing that I want to highlight to teachers, at least I believe this, I'm not sure if you'll concur, but when we're looking at those morphologic patterns in spelling, we're also getting a double whammy, because we're also helping students build their vocabulary and their understanding of language, which is going to help them with building their vocabulary and their decoding skills when it comes to reading.
Yeah, they feed into one another for sure. Morphemes are transferable units. I mean, you understand one morpheme in one word, and what that's going to do is it's going to increase your chances of figuring out not just the meaning of unfamiliar words, but the spelling of them too, possibly even the pronunciation, although pronunciation is the least stable. If you look at nat to born, being born, birth, you've got nation, national, innate, and so on. You've got all these different pronunciations for that letter string, for that morpheme. So again, I caution teaching by sound, grouping words by how they sound. That's the least stable way to do it. Grouping words by their morphemes, that's awesome and transferable. So if anyone takes anything from this away, it would be, rather than ask not what are the sounds, ask what are the morphemes.
Definitely. And one of the things I definitely want you to go into is the E, pesky silent E, magic E, whatever you want to call it. Why do we have E at the end of so many of our words, and what does it mean? And it does have different meanings depending on the situation. Can you go into that a little bit?
Sure thing. I'd like to go into it from a myth-busting perspective again.
Of course.
You will see E at the end of lots of words in English. If you are tempted to squish that E to cram it, right, into the preceding grapheme and say that's a digraph, there's a problem with that, because that's not what's happening in the word, So I'll give you an example. The word dive, right? If you say that VE is a grapheme for the sound V, then you've got a problem already, because that's not how the word is built. Furthermore, if you say heaven forbid, right? If you say that the E and the I in dive are a split digraph, again, you're starting to tell untruths about the system. And once you do that, when something's not true and you're making up a story about it, it shows that you don't know what the truth is, and you should know. And secondly, it doesn't go anywhere. You can't transfer something that's not a working part of the system to something else, right? It's a real dead end. So this split digraph thing, or even this digraph thing, that's not true. English is not a one-to-one phoneme grapheme system. It has etymological and orthographic layers as well. So it has constraints regarding the sequence of letters and the signals that those sequences will then bring to the reader or to the writer. And final silent E is one of the most common signals. So it's silent because you don't pronounce that letter, and it's fine to use the word silent. It's no problem at all. You ask a layperson, right? You go up to somebody who doesn't think about this stuff and say, what's a silent letter? What do you reckon, Kathryn? Do you think they'll be able to tell you?
Something that you don't say.
Well, go out and do it. I mean, go out onto the street right now, get the nearest passerby and go, what's a silent letter? Mostly, any literate adult will say, yeah, it's one you don't pronounce in a word, like the B and thumb, right? It has utility. Using the word silent is something that people understand, right? So use it. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with saying silent. Anyway, so we've got E at the end of words. And what it actually does is it signals certain things. It helps us to disambiguate words, and it helps us to recombine those 26 letters into the millions of words that we have, right? I mean, that's quite a feat. So E is one of those ones that produces, that is a signal that you need to pay attention to. Because it's signaling certain things. So, in terms of commonality, E will make a preceding vowel say its name, whether it's adjacent to it or not. Yep. Can't be too far away though, usually. So, you've got hat to hate. Yep. Pin to pine, cut to cute, all that sort of thing, right? E will do that. It will change. It will signal a pronunciation change, and that's awesome. E will also signal a pronunciation change when it goes after C or G. So the C will become S. The G has the choice as to whether to remain as G or J. At the end of words, final silent E will always change that G. So, you've got rag to rage and so on. Final silent E will stop words from ending with illegal letters. There are actually 5 letters in English that you can't end words with, and that's a printing convention that I haven't got time to go into right now. But I, J, Q, U, V at the end of a word, they cannot be. So what final silent E does is that it it creates the end there, so that, you know, you've got words like dive and so on. You've got, I'll write you a check, or this is unique, it's QUE. So E is a kind of solvent, a solver, if you like. It stops words from ending illegally. So, you know, that's another of its functions. Then you've got things like, you know, I ran laps of the football field, LAPS. What we've got there is a noun, a plural noun, because it's got lap, our noun. But then I wanted you to think more than one. So I put an S on the end, and that's what we do in English. However, there's a homophone, isn't there? I've let my subscription lapse, right? Now I could spell it LAPS. But immediately what that's going to do is that's going to signal up plural noun, right? So final silent E comes in and it goes, I'm going to cancel that plural, right? I don't want the last thing you see to be an S here. So because you don't say me, I can just be there and disambiguate that word. So you're not thinking, is this a plural or not? And it just makes you process the language slightly faster, right? And more efficiently. So there's plural cancelling E as well. And so on. E does all of these things. If you're just cramming it in and saying, yeah, you know, in the word lapse, SE is a spelling for the sound. No, it's not. Oh, that's not what it's doing. It's not what it's doing. And it's not hard to learn this stuff, right? And it's not hard to teach it. And children totally get it. There's no reason not to do this, not to talk about these layers and these orthographic expectancies, if you like. So E's a big one.
It is. Well, and then even it marking relationships between words like come and came. Right?
Yeah. And the pronunciation of come, that's all over the place, isn't it? You know, or is it? Like within a family, not at all. It's very, very clear why that pronunciation is as it is. The important thing is I want children to be able to recall that effortlessly from long-term memory. And to do that, I think you need to tell the truth about the language rather than make up stories about split digraphs and spellings for the sound blah. That's not what's happening. Yes. And once you start doing that, once you start looking at it in that way, it's very difficult to go back to the old way. So I encourage teachers to branch out a little and look at what's really happening. It's fascinating, transferable, memorable, and linguistically accurate, which is hugely helpful.
Yes, of course. Now, the thing that I think one of the hardest parts of the English language and the spelling system is those exceptional words. And you talk about the 7 major stories of exceptional words. Can you take a little bit to go through them and how that can help students understand and really cement that word into their memory? And, oh, okay, so it's spelled like that because of, or it breaks this rule because of this or that or the other thing.
Yeah, well, words become the words they are in written language through a process of evolution. A lot of the time, so if you think about it as an evolutionary process, there's selection, right, that goes on of what the best sequence is and so on, and words are formed that way. So we've got that sort of classic word formation. But there are other words that have come into the language for various reasons that are not formed that way, and they then are not following what you would expect them to do within the orthography. So they've evolved in another way. So there are 7 major evolutions that will account for this dashing of your orthographic hopes, if you like, right? Why the words don't conform. The first one is words that we've borrowed. Of course, what English does, and this is one of the factors in a complex orthography, is that if it takes a word from another language, and by crikey, it takes words from lots of languages, English is really friendly that way, right? What we tend to do in the spelling is we preserve something of that spelling from that language. So, words like spaghetti, you're not supposed to end words, right, with an I in English. It's a printing convention. E will be your solver or a Y, but there's spaghetti, right? Because we borrowed it from Italian, we preserve that sequence. So that's borrowing. Yeah. Then we've got words that evolved in a different way, like acronyms. So we've got an airline here in Australia, Qantas, and that stands for Queensland and Northern Territory Air Service. It's an acronym. What we did was we took that phrase and we took the first letters and we made a new word, right? That's not really how words in the majority are made, but acronyms are made. And that's one of the reasons why it doesn't, those words don't conform to the rules. It's really simple. Their evolution is different. Then we've also got words like that we've cut down, like, revolution, when your engine turns over. Yeah, that's called a revolution. It's one time around, right? But when you put your foot on the accelerator and you make your engine go, you rev, right? It's short for revolution, but we cut that word off. And now it ends with a V, which you're not allowed to do, but you are allowed to do it if you are forming words in a different way. And we're forming words as abbreviations a lot of the time as well. So rev is one of those. Then we've got names, right? Not only are names borrowed, like Iraq, you can end that word with a Q, even though you're really not supposed to in English, because it's borrowed. It's the name of something. Parents love their children. They want to distinguish their children with unusual letter sequences in the children's names. I swear that I've actually had a student who went to school with a girl called Absidy. ABCDE is how they spell her name, because you know what? You can, right? Yeah. Names are up to you. Do what you want. They don't evolve in the same way as well, Then we've got jargon and slang. So these are words either from professional groups or from younger groups who want to communicate rapidly, and perhaps under the radar of the other groups. They want to stay exclusive. So words evolve within professional groups and younger groups called jargon and slang as well. And then sometimes they creep back into the vernacular, like a borrowed word like alibi. That's a legal term. It's legal jargon. We borrowed it from Latin, but also it's now quite common. Do you have an alibi for this, and so on. So jargon and slang also drive word evolution in a very, very small way. And then we've got those words that when the printing presses, when the printers were standardizing everything and saying, not your accent, this is how it's done. There were old words already standardized. They already had their conventions around them, and everyone was spelling them the same way. So that's like, the word I, like I am happy, or you are my friend. People weren't spelling them differently. So if it's not broken, don't fix it. So sometimes old words escaped that standardization process as well. So what you've got there is borrowed, acronyms, abbreviations, names, jargon, old, and slang, which spells the word banjos, right? And that helps you. I've created an acronym with a double A because it's an acronym. I can have two A's, right? So that helps you remember where those words fit in. It will always be very, very often going to be one of those stories. And so we go over that with our students. And again, that helps to bust that myth, that I'm teaching a rule. Oh, this doesn't follow the rule. I guess English is too complex to learn. Let's walk away.
Yeah. And what do you feel these past 2.5 decades of instant messaging and text messaging is doing to our spelling system?
I don't think it's having any impact whatsoever. If anything, what it is, it's another form of language, and therefore it has it has rules, it has constraints, and it has a grammar all of itself. So if actually you're very good at creating those abbreviations during texting and so on, what you are is bilingual actually, and your brain is slightly better, right? So I don't have the normal view on that. I think this other form of language is great, and the only time it could possibly be an issue is if teachers don't say to children, there's this thing called register, and there's formal and informal. If you want to impress the person that you're communicating with, I suggest you go as formal as you can, right? And this is what formal is. And when I'm teaching you to read and write, I'm doing that in a formal way. There's nothing wrong with your informal register, but there is a way to get through life, right? And to be impressive in your communication. This is the way. So, if you establish that, without denigrating anybody else's linguistic differences, you've got a great situation there. Cat. Marvin has come up to see. What do you do?
Yeah. So there's two more things that I'm hoping to talk about in the last 12 minutes. Hopefully we can get them both in. The first is the importance of identifying language merger, because that has a huge role in our spelling, and especially when we're looking at individuals speaking different dialects and who are English as an additional language learner. Understanding how sometimes we are omitting syllables. A perfect example is two of my children have language merger names, Margaret and Frederick. Right? It's not Margaret, M-A-R-G-A-R-E-T.
Right. So I'm just clarifying. So when you say language merger, are you talking
when you're merging the syllables together?
Yeah, got it. Okay, yeah. Just making sure. So so syllable illusion.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I call them as collapsing syllables.
Oh, collapsing syllables. Okay.
In the book, which is kind of a user-friendly way of saying syllable elision. Yeah, absolutely. Speech is incredibly rapid, right? When writing was first, was invented, they weren't even doing spaces between words, right? Because there's no spaces between words and speech. So it actually took someone to go, oh, it would be a good idea if we actually separated those words out. Who'd have thunk it, right? So again, different, very, very different forms of language. So therefore, when you're speaking, you speak rapidly, and a lot of the time in polysyllabic words, you will emphasize usually the bases of the words, and the prefixes and suffixes or the secondary bases are going to be given less energy, given less breath. We're economical when we speak, and that then leads to collapsing syllables, I call them, or syllable elision, where the speech and the spelling of those syllables doesn't match, like Margaret, Frederick, not Margaret, Frederick, right? And we do it with lots and lots of polysyllabic words. To understand that, you need to understand schwa. You need to understand the purpose of schwa, what that's for, what it's all about, and what the most likely spelling of a schwa syllable is. And so there are ways to do that as well, systematically and frankly. Definitely. Does that answer your question, Kathryn? I can't even remember what your question was, but okay.
Well, talking about how the collapsing of syllables happens and the importance of helping students understand that it does happen. So instead of saying library, at least a lot of people up here say library, and you lose that syllable, and then you see that when you're looking at spelling errors. And I guess I've added one more thing that I want to discuss, because I think it can be so telling of what our students are thinking and hearing. And that's looking at spelling error analysis and using that to help us understand where our students' language is and their understanding of that translating speech to text, speech to print.
Well, yeah, spelling errors are very telling. What we tend to see, and I think we can make improvements on this at Lifelong Literacy, is children stuck at phonetic spelling. So they'll just spell words the way that they hear them. And what that indicates is that they've had instruction from a system, not necessarily one teacher, but from a system that doesn't have very much knowledge regarding writing. So that's, it's a huge problem. They get stuck at this phonetic spelling. And of course, that's not going to work for polysyllabic words. What works for polysyllabic words is, again, morphemes. But also what works is giving children practice structures when they're studying words, and actually having them practice, spelling words in a productive way rather than an unproductive way. Now, that then goes back to this idea that there's a huge myth in education that is you place words into long-term memory in your visual memory. You use your visual memory. It's a visual thing, right? And the important thing about words is the visual. I mean, look at MSV, right? Visual information. Studies, many of them, time and time again, have proven that that is not the case. It is not an act of visual memory to recall a letter sequence. It's nothing to do with your visual memory whatsoever. But because it's like kind of convenient and sort of instinctively, if you don't look underneath the surface of it all, instinctively it seems to work, it seems to be okay, then lots of practice that children are given is based on this visual thing. So they're doing things like rainbow writing, or color in this bit of the word, or stare at the word. It will go in if you stare at it because it's your visual memory. It's not true. You need to give children practice structures that will actually stick, and it's got nothing to do with visual, right? It's got nothing to do with visual. So it's really, really important. Take a word like Wednesday, right? We'll get that syllable elision right there. Wednesday, really weird. Because it was Odin's day. The days of the week were named after Norse gods and things in the sky. So Odin's day was Wednesday, and that became Woden's day, where we get the wed bit from. You could get a kid to write that out 100 times. You could get them to put boxes around, the shape of the word. You could get them to color it in. You could get them to write it lots of different. But if you actually just say to them, wed-ness day, that's how you spell it, that's going to go in, right? And if you practice just saying Wednesday, as we do, right, as adults, when you write Wednesday, tell me you don't say Wednesday in your head.
Oh, totally.
That's what good spellers do. Or that's what people to be good spellers do. Mm-hmm. You teach them to do that, right? Mm-hmm. There is no way you learned Wednesday coloring it in, did you, Kathryn? Right? You practiced it. Wednesday, skizzers, and so on. Like all of those words with this elision, to practice it, you will say, those parts, even if you don't hear them in speech. That's how you do it. It's got bugger all to do with, excuse my language, to do with visual.
Definitely. And I do want to touch on the homophones.
Yeah.
The importance of looking at the word structure and how they're pronounced, and how we can teach those like words together to help debunk the myth of homophones, or not myth, but the misunderstanding.
It starts with this principle, and it's called the Homophone Principle, I think, in structured word inquiry circles. And it's basically, wherever possible, if two words sound the same, they will be spelled differently in the orthography in order to disambiguate them. It's one of the factors in a complex orthography again, right? Yeah, so there's different spellings of different words. Those differences will be governed by their morphemes, which is governed by their etymology, right? So again, you got to know this stuff. You should know this stuff. But it's a lifelong, learning curve, as I said. So we've got lots of words that sound the same. And therefore, if you are stuck at what are the sounds in this word, then you've lost the game. The game is gone, because it's not the sounds that are important. It's the morphemes that are important. So if we take something like there, there, and there, right? They've got very different morphemes in them. If you look at it morpheme by morpheme, you're going to get a much better result. You start with the easy one. Yep. Then you move on to the harder one. So the easy one, the actual easy one, is they, THEY'. That's easy to teach, because you've got your solid THEY, they, and then you've got a contraction 'RE. And that's easy to teach systematically. That's where you would start. In a completely different unit of time, you would teach the other ones, but teaching them together, that's not a good idea either, because there's a lot in the structure of those words. But if you take that word they, in there, they are, you've got Y at the end. Now, always suspect, why is there a Y there? Well, there's a Y there because we can't spell they, THEI, right? Because the conventions dictate that you can't have I at the end of a word. So that's where the Y comes in. However, if it's not the end of the word anymore, like if you're adding like a possessive signaler like the letter R, you could return that illegal I, and that's how there is formed, belonging to them, they, right? But you got to start simple. And then way over there in another unit of time, you want to start teaching here, as in come here, HERE here. Don't try and say it out, say the letter names, HERE here. That's a location. Guess what? There are other words that contain almost exactly the same sequence of letters that will tell you about location as well. So if you learn to spell here, HERE here, then you can also then use that as a platform, as a foundation for there, as in go over there, or where do you want that, right? So that's a different subject, that's a different unit altogether. And if you, I suggest teaching all of them, not on the same day, right? Because they're completely different words with different structures and different conventions and things going on in them. That's homophones. That's I've got a whole list, huge list in the book of homophones, but that list is in no way intended to be teach all of these together. Cognitively, that's a huge load. Take them one by one, dispose of them, and then move on to the next. That's my recommendation.
Yes, and it's better to draw in those features that are similar with other words at the same time. So, teaching the words in that family, like there, we're, I can't think of other ones at the moment, but something word and then are, the contractions. And doing that's going to help them form that concept and be a more useful focus for a week or a few days in the lesson, instead of teaching all three on one day and then giving a spelling test at the end of the week, making sure that they can tell the differences based on the sentence that you use when they're half paying attention to what you're saying.
Yeah, it's a bit of a dead end, isn't it? And, there will be here's the thing, there will be some children who will get it like that, some people have brains like that. Great. Lovely. I'm not interested in them. I'm interested in the ones that have to struggle, that have to work hard to do it, because I want to make their job easier. I want to lessen the struggle. And time again, what I find is you lessen the struggle by telling the truth about what the system actually is and what it contains. And you do that systematically, and you do it with patience.
Definitely. Well, this is just scratching the surface. There is so much more about spelling. It's a fascinating topic. And especially when you start looking at that morphology and the etymology and how it interlinks, and even the orthography, understanding those rules.
Yeah.
When you take the time to do it, yes, it's very easy to do a deep dive into this, but it allows you to say more to your students than just because.
Yeah.
And it's going to help your understanding and your communication and be more rewarding for you. And then instead of taking out a red marker, circling those words with the incorrect spelling, you're like, well, it's just wrong. Why do you know that it's wrong? Well, because it's been beaten into you enough, or you've been fortunate enough to understand it. But if we're able to do this in an explicit manner, we're going to catch so many more students, and it's going to make your job easier.
Yeah.
Because you're not going to have to try and guess based on these invented spellings from students.
Quite.
Well, thank you for joining me again today, Lynn. I look forward to our conversation next week on your thoughts about writing.
Woohoo. Thank you, Kathryn. It's always a pleasure.